I'd like to introduce her. She's a lecturer in museum education at the School of Education at the University of Glasgow. She has a background in humanities, specializing in the connections between people, place, via the process of heritage and interrogating the potential of creative practice and digital technologies to this end. Um, and Nicole has a working background in cultural heritage sector, and she specializes in digital technology, museum, libraries, archives, and art galleries. And so I'm sure she will be talking about her experience, her background, and expertise in this area in her talk. So I think it's still it's co-design methods for heritage learning in community organization partnerships. So I think that's still the title, but Nicole will correct me. So I'll stop sharing and I'll allow you to share your screen, Nicole.
Great.
And very good, great welcome. And welcome to everyone who's joined us. And yeah, well, have some questions. So the usual process is if you think of a question or a comment, please pop it into the chat. I'll be keeping an eye on it. And then about 40 minutes or so, we'll stop and then we'll have a look and have answer some of your questions. Okay. So I'll hand over to you, Nicole. Thanks very much.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul. And sorry, I wrote such a long introduction to who I was. I think it's because I was trying to think about, what would be relevant to this kind of project and what it is I'm going to be describing. So just to check, you can see the slide. Great, not a random part of my screen, that's good. Okay, so I've got a kind of outline of what I'm intending to talk about here today. I'm just going to move us over to there so I can see what I'm doing. So I'm going to be reflecting on a research project that ended in around 2020, and it was a partnership and funded by Historic England. So I was leading the team who were working with lots of community-led and community-based archaeology groups who were recording burial spaces. And the intention of the project was to create new tools for recording burial spaces. And I'm not going to be talking about the archaeology today, but I have got just 2 slides just to kind of talk about why we were doing that and why that was important. But essentially, they're at-risk spaces. So this had at its heart kind of a participatory and a practice-based methodology. The title of today's presentation is co-design. There are co-design aspects to this project. It, in fact, is a kind of mashup between a participatory project and kind of sub-co-design projects. And I'm going to talk about how that worked together. So that's kind of the realities of doing a project with a large heritage organisation and also something that's funded and is in partnership with the university. So I'm going to chat a bit about that. So what I'm going to do is introduce the project to you, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the overarching methodology. And I want to kind of think to you about how this methodology came to be. So I've attempted to sort of identify some of the key influencing theories behind the approach. The project that I'm discussing, Discovering England's Burial Spaces, is a kind of moment within an ecosystem of projects. And those were all around burial spaces. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how they interconnect and how they influenced each other, because that has, impacted on the decisions about the methodology and the methods themselves. So then I'm going to outline the methods, and I'm going to talk about how we co-designed digital tools for recording. And then I'm going to reflect on some of the implications of that at different levels. So although this talk is focused on the methods that we used, I am going to talk a little bit about the intended and the actual impacts of the research, because that sort of part of explains why we had this overall approach and why we used the methods we did. And then at the end, if we've got time, I'm going to just really briefly acknowledge some of the challenges around using participatory and co-design approaches. And that has a kind of particular focus on the sort of enmeshments between individuals and groups and larger organizations like universities. Great. So a really brief background to this work and who I am. I'm an archaeologist. I worked for several years as a museum curator down in the south of England, and I specialised in archaeology, in learning and engagement, and later in digital media. I've always had a focus on engagement. Today I'm talking about methods, but we collect methods as we move through the world. And as you've seen from the other lectures in this series, if you've watched any of those, our methodologies aren't constructed in a vacuum. And so we're really influenced by our own worldviews and the systems within which we operate. And so in view of this, I just wanted to give a bit of context to the methodology and to the methods as well. So essentially my work is practice-based. I'm an archaeologist. I've headed up excavations and surveys and interpretation projects. And so my research is really kind of informed by this need to always be based within practice. And as a curator, I've designed exhibitions and learning programs, and that work has always necessarily been kind of end-use focused. So I come from an arts and humanities background, but I also have a sneaky MSc in web science, and I did a stint in a computer science department for a while. So there was a kind of period where I was reconciling my practice-based arts and humanities background with where I found myself within electronics and computer science. And I think that kind of comes out in the methodology that this project has at its heart. So my heart has always been with image making in archaeology and the potential of that to tell stories about the past. And that's where this project came from. So way back since 2004, I've been working on digital image making projects, and lots of those projects have been with community groups who have an interest in the history and the archaeology of their own local area. And so I've done a lot of work in public archaeology. From 2007 onwards, I worked with my now husband, who's a tiny person in this picture here, on a project to record memorials and headstones within burial spaces. And this project I'm going to talk a little bit about today. This was driven by an identification of burial grounds as a really great case study to think about heritage at risk. And so that was one of the motivations behind this project coming into being. Burial spaces are, something that is of local interest, but memorials might be of regional or national or global significance. Some of the groups who took part in the work that we did wanted to do recording because they were interested in digital technologies rather than the burial spaces themselves. And that has impacted on the methods and the methodology that I'm going to be talking about. So essentially, I worked for about 10 years, from about 2007 to 2017, on projects to record burial spaces. And I did that with Gareth Beale, who was a key collaborator, and he's a lecturer here also at the University of Glasgow within the School of Humanities. And this was kind of a side project. We started it when we were master's students in 2004. And so when I say we within this presentation, I'm talking about him and me, but other collaborators who kind of came in and out as we moved through our academic careers. The project I'm talking about today ran from 2017 to 2020. I actually missed the end of the project because I went onto unexpected maternity leave when my son arrived very early into the world. So I wouldn't necessarily have written up some of the work in the way that it's been written up, but I think that's a really interesting part of the narrative of the methodology. And so I'll come back to that briefly later on. Okay, so I promised it's not a lecture about headstones, but I'm just going to highlight why the project existed, and then I'll tell you about the project itself. There's a high-level need to better understand burial grounds in the UK. The national bodies under which the care of some of the burial spaces falls have acknowledged that there's a really urgent need to understand their heritage significance. They're spaces that are at risk. Lots of them don't have people who are paid to look after them. And about 15 years ago, Historic England, which is the big national body that cares for the historic environment in England, identified that there was a need for a national recording project. So there's kind of context to the project, and there was a sort of need for that. So when I wrote the project, I envisaged it as a kind of way to contribute to lots of the big issues in burial space care. Condition surveying, transcriptions, identifying at-risk sites, site management, all of that kind of thing. But I also wanted it to be a way for community groups to have a say in all of the above, to be actively contributing to discussions about burial space management and to make changes. And of course, if you think about that, how that would kind of spread across having a say within cultural heritage management more broadly. Already you can see there are loads of things at play here. There's a need to kind of impact on the ground level, at practice level, but also to think about it at a kind of policy level and how heritage bodies are telling stories about burial grounds. Okay, I'm not going to say anything more about archaeology. There were 3 key stages to the project. The first was a kind of loose pilot called Rereading the British Memorial Project. Then there was a scoping project. And then thirdly, a funded Discovering England's Burial Spaces project. And I'm going to talk about each of those. This project, Rereading the British Memorial, came out of us wanting to experiment with digital technologies and enjoying the process of recording. It's about 10 years before the Discovering England's Burial Spaces project came to be. We weren't actively seeking out community groups, but they were finding us through word of mouth. We were interested in the digital technologies, not really the burial spaces themselves. And it was a really sort of iteratively developing methodology. It was highly reflexive. We were sort of merrily training community groups to use digital technologies. We ran about 50 workshops, but we weren't providing any advice on what to do next. So community groups were finding their own ways to share that work. And we were doing this as a kind of practice-led thing. Community groups were doing things like printing out images and putting them into parish magazines. They might be putting videos on YouTube of drone shots of cemeteries. We weren't getting involved in that interpretation of the data or the publication of the work. We just didn't have the capacity to do that. But it became clear that the people we were training other people, and that everybody was getting trained in this one moment of recording, this kind of very small piece of the puzzle. And that actually, this had been a really top-down affair to this point. And we wanted to start to kind of formalize the sort of workflows for recording and think about what kind of a methodology could we work with people in a participatory manner to do that. So what would that look like? Seems really obvious now that we needed to do that, but that project wasn't really a project at this point. It had a name so that we could talk about it, but there wasn't really a formal methodology. It was kind of based on an enthusiasm for digital imaging and a love of free biscuits in church halls. So the next step, I realise now, reflecting on it, was a kind of organically formed scoping exercise. So it happened in a piecemeal way from kind of 2015 to 2016 as we were working with community groups, and it formed through observation, secondary data analysis, and a narrative literature review. I wanted to understand what was happening to the work that was being undertaken, and to kind of build a picture of what that might mean for long-term access to records and the reuse of records. So we don't need to look necessarily at what the findings were, but essentially stuff wasn't being kept. And if it was being kept, it wasn't being kept necessarily in an accessible format. So Discovering England's Burial Spaces came about. It all kind of formed into this project proposal with colleagues at the University of York to Historic England to fund work to look at how to work with community groups. And we wanted to improve how we understand the significance of burial grounds. So we wanted to kind of produce a methodology for high quality data capture, interpretation, archiving, and sharing. So that's the essential kind of project. And we wanted to do that with community groups. And we had really good contacts with community groups through doing the Rereading British Memorials project. We wanted to kind of actively create a space for DIY innovation. And we'd sort of seen anecdotally that was coming out. There was evidence of innovation with the groups that we were working with. And we wanted to kind of identify whether that was a kind of driver for involvement in these kind of recording projects to think about heritage. And so, how could we kind of incorporate that into heritage knowledge building in a more sort of formal way? And that's sort of one of the reasons why the methodology came out in the way that it did. So we had quite a kind of straightforward process for carrying out the work and for measuring success, but the methodology behind it is participatory. And so it kind of acknowledges this really complicated nature of how we have a kind of increasing reliance on the role of volunteers in the sort of identification and the care of heritage within the UK. And there were sort of co-design aspects to what we were doing to some of the practice-based work, and I'm going to talk about that next. So it's a really big question for community archaeology and the sector, heritage sector as a whole, is how do we kind of overcome this top-down approach to knowledge generation? We were using participatory research approaches and also practice-based research approaches that came from the creative industries, because that's my and Gareth's background. We're both makers and we're both archaeologists, and so our work is really situated in practice. The plan was to work with group-led projects, so that they were undertaking work into their own research into burial grounds, and we were spending time with them through multiple methods to understand their motivations for doing that and their intentions for the outputs. And we hoped that that work would then provide insights into the prospect of archaeology to drive technological change. So could taking part in archaeology be part of technology, digital technology development, and be a motivator also for the access for digital technologies and learning around that? So we began by kind of looking at existing methods that were being used by groups, and that was participatory. So we worked with local groups to then co-design sub-projects, and then we created tools through a co-design approach that made up a kind of overarching recording, interpretation, and publication workflow. And then we brought all of that together to think about what that meant for the significance of burial grounds. So I'm just going to break that down, because obviously that's a big, kind of quite a big methodology, although quite simple. It has a lot kind of within it that I'm going to talk about in its parts. While I was kind of thinking about the shape of the methodology and reflecting on this in preparation for this presentation, I was sort of thinking about influences and what had sort of influenced the way that the methodology had turned out. And there are loads of kind of different theories that have impacted on that. And I just wanted to highlight 3 of them, because I think that they are ones that I've carried with me through my academic career. And I do think that they have shaped the way that I approach digital technology design. The first one is Donna Haraway's cyborg metaphor. I came across this in 1999 when I started university. I was doing a history of art degree, and this paper I found accidentally, and it absolutely blew my mind. And this kind of idea that technology is part of us was totally beguiling to me. I was absolutely like obsessed with this, and I sort of, I think I still acknowledge that all the way through my career. I think it's this kind of sense of avoiding technological determinism. So not feeling that technology, digital technology, is always going to be a solution to an answer, and trying to kind of shoehorn it in, or saying, we want to make a mobile app, let's think of a project to do that. So as a researcher into digital technology, I think I sort of see digital solutions sometimes as a false friend, and that might seem like to be a bit at odds with what I do. But yeah, actually, you know, I rely more on paper-based prototyping, and I take a kind of post-digital approach to that. So you can, if you're interested in that in an education context, you can look up Knox, and I've put all the references for this in the bibliography. So at the heart of everything I do, there's a paper that I read back in 2003, which was about Bourdieu's idea of habitus, and this idea of how we need to attend to the construction of the object in our research. So this idea that like it's kind of on us as researchers to think about how we construct objects and how that can help us to think about questions. So basically we have to think about technology within its kind of social lived practice. It's never kind of existing away from that. And so I've put this paper in the reading list, even though it's 20 years old. It's still a really nice, easy read, and a great introduction to the idea that we have to think about sociocultural factors, and we can't get too hung up on digital technology being any different from any other technologies like clothes. They come into being through a need, and as an archaeologist, I really like that idea. And then thirdly, Doreen Massey's work on For Space, which is all about how we think about space as something that is socially constructed, rather than being a kind of physical locality. And that, as an archaeologist, that really impacts on how I think about time and space away from materiality. It's about how we make connections with one another, and that's how I think about image making. That's kind of for another presentation, but it's a lot like how Tim Ingold talks about how anthropology and archaeology meet one another, where everything and everyone are kind of made up of interwoven and interconnected lines. And so if you're interested in that idea, there's some links there. But essentially, this is kind of a slide to illustrate that we're impacted on the theory that's around us, whether we're generating theory through our work or we're using what already exists. We can't really get away from that. So how does that kind of come into the methodology? When I was based in computer science back in 2011, I found out about participatory approaches, and I'd been using components of this research in an instinctive manner throughout my career, but hadn't really had a kind of theoretical scaffold for this. And when I wrote the funding application for discovering England's burial spaces, the methodology that I used was predominantly based on Vines et al. And this is a 2013 paper that came from human-computer interaction. And that made sense because I was based in digital creativity labs later on. And it essentially had these three components that we share control with users. So in the DEBS project, that comes out that the people who are affected by the outcomes of the design research should have a say in what the outcomes are. So practically, we can do things like develop memorandums of understanding that are written in collaboration with the groups and participants that we're working with. We kind of thought about the initiators and the beneficiaries of the work that we were doing. And although we'd sort of historically made contact with groups in the region, we wanted to work with groups who had particular aspects, who had interest in particular aspects of graveyards and wanted to do particular things. And we wanted to support those needs and those interests. And we sort of advertised and marketed the project so that there would be a sort of cascading approach in an attempt to kind of try to limit the bias of our research findings. We were really interested in the kind of micro dynamics of the relationships, and we spent lots of time talking with group members about their motivations for involvement. And we also wanted to openly acknowledge organizational drivers. So, for example, we dedicated a whole workshop to making sure that we were talking about what the kind of big organization partners in the project had as their kind of key strategies and what they were wanting to achieve, so that there was a kind of transparency around that. The sort of second component is this idea of sharing expertise, so that we're making sure that the methods that we were using to design tools were eliciting knowledge from users, and that we were kind of developing these sort of not long-term but medium-term relationships with the people we were working with and having regular contact. So we were kind of wanting to sort of build into our methodology this awareness of technological determinism and try to avoid predicting how users were going to use technologies. As part of that, there was also this need to find ways to respect groups' ownership of data and to deal with that kind of sticky topic of intellectual property, and make sure that, you know, even that we were thinking about how they wanted the archaeology to be represented, contributing to debates about intellectual property and copyright and all of that kind of thing. Then finally, we have this thing of inspiring change, and this is a really challenging aspect of participatory design. So, you know, we were trying to kind of develop resources that were sustainable, tools that could be developed upon and changed after they'd been made. And we worked really hard to highlight alternatives to participants. So while we were undertaking the participatory research, we were talking about different tools that we might use, and we were bringing in things from elsewhere, and we were making sure that we weren't just completely obsessed with, we have to make a mobile app, but really kind of thinking about what the wants of the people involved were. We also had this kind of additional explicit aim, which came straight out of the Vines paper, which was to try to improve digital technology for the future and to support people to do the things that we were seeing was coming out of their motivations for involvement, like spending more time outdoors. So we did things like we worked with a charity to look at recording biodiversity and building that into our workflow so that there was a kind of flexibility of focus for the people involved in the project. So basically, to enact all of these principles, we had to have a sort of iteratively developing program. And that was based on the user needs, but also on this, we also kind of had to measure that against like mission creep and kind of moving away from the needs of the organizations that we were working with. And I don't have time to kind of go into this in great detail, but there are basically challenges with doing that, with having that kind of partnership with large organizations. I'll talk a little bit about this at the end. So here are the essential kind of core methods, although other things came in around the periphery. But we had this kind of iteratively developing practice-based approach. So there were some practice-led components depending on which group we were working with. So this is essentially what we did. And I've kind of clumped these into two bits, but I'll kind of tell you about them in order. we met up with groups and we showcased like ways that you could use digital image making. We gave kind of examples of how you can record archaeology and heritage. Then we kind of met up and we workshopped what the needs were for groups and individuals at different levels. And this was sort of an opportunity also to workshop challenges, what they thought were challenges, what we thought were challenges, what other organizations thought were challenges. We then began running image making workshops, showing how you could use different techniques to make images. Now that ran throughout the whole project and it changed based on group requirements, and we were super flexible with this, and we brought in people who could do things that we couldn't do, and we developed our skills as we went so we could show other things. We then worked together in the field to evaluate existing tools. So we critiqued these together and we sort of imagined alternative versions of these that might work better for what it was that we wanted. We also conducted observation in the field. So we actively participated in fieldwork. We also undertook overt observation during the fieldwork once those groups were set up and they didn't need our support. And that kind of switched, we sort of switched between the two as we went. We also sat down together after fieldwork sessions and we imagined futures for burial grounds, and we used that to inform new pathways for record making. And then finally, we had specific sessions where we focused on a challenge, and then we did paper-based prototyping to that end. And those challenges were big or small, depending on at what point we were at the project and what the group wanted. So the co-design aspect comes into play across several of these methods as we worked with kind of each group to think about problem solving for different aspects of the workflow. The structure of the co-design workshops, so the ones that are kind of within the box on the left here, were around this kind of cycle of design idea. So that you kind of empathize, think about problems, think about approaches, you then define that, you then kind of come up with ideas, and then you create prototypes, and then you go round again. So you're kind of constantly iteratively improving, and each of the workshops were kind of moving towards that, despite the fact the challenges that we were introducing were different each time. And as part of that kind of cycle of design, we were also using creative prompts. So we were working with groups on these kind of specific challenges within the recording process. And then we were returning to those several times throughout the process. And that was kind of an attempt to move away from some of the limitations around designing tools when you're trying to do something in a co-design or a participatory way. So, you know, it's really hard to imagine something that's not influenced by what we already know about digital technologies. And so, you know, we're trying to kind of break free from that and maybe not project our feelings about digital technologies onto what we're trying to imagine. And then also at the same time, we're developing a kind of intimate relationship with the affordances of a specific digital technology so that we can kind of understand that, and that can contribute to what it is that we're imagining. So there are kind of two things that are working against each other, but they're existing at the same time within the project. So you have those methods, but running alongside those activities that I've just outlined, there were also lots of mechanisms for collecting data and kind of reflecting on that work. So we ran workshops to tell everyone about why we were doing what we were doing. And these were kind of points of reflection, like critical junctures within the research process. We held guest lectures from organisations that were linked to the project. We invited groups to the university, and we talked about, we also went and talked to local heritage and archaeology groups about what we were doing with the project participants. So this was all kind of part of that commitment to transparency. And we were sort of sharing successes and failures and developing relationships with software and hardware makers so we could critique what they were doing as well together. And we also brought groups together to do kind of cross-project working so that we could develop new research ideas. Sometimes challenges we picked were really small, based on a kind of individual's interest, and sometimes they were at a sort of societal level, but they all had equal importance within the way that we were structuring the workshops. And as well as observation, we conducted journaling, and I know that's been covered, so I won't talk about that in detail. But all of this kind of helped us to collect reflections and to kind of build a picture of how individuals were using digital technologies. So the methodology was sort of inspired by meta design theory, this sense that we are kind of trying to design kind of with unanticipated future use in mind. So that's got a lot of in common actually with like the universal design for learning approach. This idea that kind of sort of beyond participatory design approaches or practices, the co-design approach will sort of result in a system that users can continuously adapt by adding and requesting changes while they're using that system. So as an example of that, we were going to make a mobile app. Anybody who's tried to use mobile apps outside, particularly in places where there maybe isn't very good reception, will know that there are issues. We thought it was a logical thing for data capture. We did field tests. Nobody wanted to use it. You have to take your gloves off to use any data when you're living in Yorkshire, where one of the case studies was. It just wasn't going to work. And so we thought instead about having a desktop application that you could use after you'd done recording. But we gave it mobile styling so you could still use it in the field, which nobody did, incidentally. So we saw lots of changes throughout the project. Digital technology was being changed by people. People were kind of doing really exciting innovations in digital technology, repurposing technology that we'd introduced in a way that we could never have done and had time indeed to do. The digital recording system was produced with this intention that we would have this kind of national database, which we launched. But part of it, we had to kind of think about all these issues around participatory working, to think about, Creative Commons licensing, intellectual property, recognizing groups' contributions to heritage knowledge. So like as an example for that, some of our academic outputs have community groups as co-authors rather than just acknowledging them. The research brought out loads of questions about what does this kind of participatory working mean for community archaeology projects? And what does that mean for the archaeological record? So we see that there's kind of scope for cross-scale learning here to influence policy through the development of kind of a narrative about how participants are engaging with heritage by recording archaeology. So basically we have this kind of pick and mix methodology, but there's a need to kind of acknowledge that there has to be flexibility to enable the researchers to incorporate methodological innovations and to work with the participants to do that. And I guess the next step would be to think about, could we think about the design of these participatory methodologies that have these kind of co-design components to them? So just my last slide before I finish is to say that this wasn't fully a co-design project, but it had co-design strands embedded within it. The thing with co-design is that we have this responsibility to those taking part, whether they're sort of experts by lived experience or they're partners or participants, to sort of maintain control of the central goals of the project. Because if no one knows what the aims are, we all lose our way. And so we did that by having clear components that were co-design and a participatory kind of scaffold. Gaining funding from a heritage body brought challenges, and it meant that, we really struggled to bring together kind of what they needed and what we needed. And I've put some references to thinking about participatory action research into the bibliography for you. So yeah, I think the essential message is, we saw lots of reciprocal learning, lots of long-term learning through being part of image making, and following these kind of trajectories of interest to see if there were sort of pathways to cultural heritage management activities. But yes, so I think I'll end because we want to have time for questions. But I've just published a paper that talks about some of this, and I'm happy to share preprints if anybody is interested in that. And I think essentially it's to kind of say, we can use these creative methods and participatory and co-design methodologies, but it's about having a kind of sense of the fact that these exist within entanglements, and we need to consider those when we're designing our approaches. Thank you.